Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. So here's a question. Why would a town pay double salary for a simple job? I'll tell you why. Because nobody stays long enough to collect it. Tonight I've got 7 real stories from people who took winter jobs in small mountain towns. Mail delivery, school bus driving, pharmacy work. Normal stuff, right? Wrong. These folks showed up thinking easy money. What they found was way darker. Towns with secrets, people acting strange, and rules that don't make sense until it's too late to leave. Hit subscribe and smash that like button. Drop a comment where you're watching from. Lights off, volume up. Let's get into it. I was 31 when I got the emergency call about Millbrook Falls. Name's Sandra Blackwood. Been fixing HVAC systems across Pennsylvania for 8 years now. That February morning, I was supposed to have the day off, but my supervisor, Frank, called at 5:30 a.m., panic in his voice. Sandra, I need you to drop everything. Elementary school up in Millbrook Falls. Their heating's been out for 3 days, and it's supposed to hit 30 tonight. If we don't get it running today, they'll have to evacuate the whole building. The drive up took 2 hours through a blizzard that seemed to get worse the closer I got to town. Millbrook Falls sits in a valley so deep between 2 ridges that the sun barely touches it in winter. Population maybe 350, the kind of place where everybody knows when a stranger drives through. By the time I reached the school, the wind was howling like something dying, and my truck's thermometer read 22-degree warnings. The school building looked wrong from the parking lot. Built sometime in the 70s, red brick, but there was something about the windows. They were all fogged up from the inside, like the building was breathing. No lights on that I could see, which seemed odd for a Tuesday morning, even with classes canceled. Principal Martinez met me at the front door, bundled in a winter coat so thick she could barely move her arms. Middle-aged woman, probably been running this school for years, but she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Thank God you're here," she said, and I could see her breath even though we were technically indoors. "It's been getting colder every day. We can't even keep the pipes from freezing anymore." The moment I stepped inside, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal service call. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, like breathing through wet cotton. And cold, not just winter cold, but the kind of cold that seems to reach inside your bones and squeeze. My fingers started going numb immediately, even through my insulated work gloves. "How long has the system been down?" I asked, following her down a hallway lined with children's artwork that looked oddly faded. "That's just it," she said, stopping to unlock a door marked basement access. "It's not down. It's running perfectly. We've had 3 different contractors out here and they all say the same thing. Everything's working exactly like it should be." The basement staircase descended into darkness, so complete my flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up before it could illuminate anything useful. Each step down felt like walking into a freezer, the temperature dropping noticeably with every level. By the time we reached the bottom, I could see my breath forming thick clouds that hung in the air without dissipating. The boiler was massive, probably cost the district $40,000 when they installed it 6 years ago. And it was running. I could hear the fuel burning, feel the vibrations through the concrete floor, see all the right readings on the control panel. But standing 3 feet away from a heating system that should have been throwing off serious BTUs, I was colder than I'd been outside in the blizzard. I checked my digital thermometer. 18-degree air in a basement with a running heating system. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, walking around the boiler to check the ductwork. That's when I noticed the fuel consumption reports Principal Martinez had brought down. In the past week alone, They'd burned through 500 gallons of heating oil. For a building this size, 100 gallons should have lasted the entire month, even in brutal cold. "It's like the system is eating fuel but producing no heat," she said, "and it's been getting worse every day." I spent the next 4 hours running every diagnostic I knew. Heat exchanger was clean, ductwork was properly sealed, circulation pumps were working perfectly. I even called the manufacturer's tech line, and the guy basically told me what I was describing was physically impossible. But there was something else bothering me about that basement. The shadows fell wrong, at angles that didn't match where the lights were positioned. And every so often, just at the edge of my vision, I'd catch movement that disappeared the instant I turned to look, like someone was watching me work. The worst part was the silence. Not natural quiet, the complete absence of sound that makes your ears ring. No mechanical hums except for the boiler, no settling of the building, no mice scurrying around, just dead, oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. By evening, I'd exhausted every logical explanation I could think of. The system was running perfectly and consuming fuel at an impossible rate while the building got colder every hour. I told Principal Martinez I'd need to come back the next day with different equipment, maybe bring in some portable heaters to supplement the system. That night, I stayed at a motel about 15 miles out of town, the only one still open in the area. The desk clerk, an older woman with suspicious eyes, asked what brought me to the valley. When I mentioned the school, her expression changed completely. "You're working on the heating system?" she asked. "Been having problems since they messed with that basement 30 years ago. Should have left well enough alone." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head and said some stories weren't hers to tell. But she did mention that Frank Morrison, who ran the local hardware store, had lived in Millbrook Falls his whole life and knew the history better than anyone. The next morning, I stopped by Morrison's hardware before heading back to the school. Frank was probably in his 70s, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of the mountains themselves. When I explained what I was dealing with at the school, his face went pale. "They never should have broken through that seal," he said quietly. 1993. They were renovating the basement, upgrading the foundation. Construction crew found an old chamber that had been sealed up since the 1800s. Instead of calling historians or archaeologists, they just broke through. According to Frank, the school was built on the site of the original Millbrook Falls schoolhouse, a one-room building from the 1840s. In 1847, a diphtheria outbreak had killed 16 children in 2 weeks, nearly every school-aged child in the valley. The community had been devastated. They buried those children in a chamber beneath the schoolhouse, Frank explained. Not just their bodies, all their belongings, their school supplies, their toys. The idea was they could keep learning even after death. It was meant to stay sealed forever. When the 1993 renovation crew broke through, they'd found the chamber exactly as it had been left. 16 small skeletons surrounded by perfectly preserved slates, wooden rulers, tin lunch pails, and small shoes. But instead of treating it as a historical site, they'd simply scattered the remains throughout the new foundation and sealed everything up with concrete. The heating problems started right after that, Frank said. Every winter since 1993, that building's been cold, getting worse each year, like something's been growing stronger down there. I drove back to the school with a growing sense of unease. What Frank had told me should have been easy to dismiss, just local folklore, small-town superstition. But after spending a day in that basement, feeling the wrongness that permeated every corner of it, I wasn't so quick to rationalize anymore. Principal Martinez was waiting for me with a stack of maintenance records going back to the building's construction. The pattern was undeniable. Every winter since 1993, heating problems that defied mechanical explanation. Contractors who couldn't find anything wrong but couldn't fix the cold either. Fuel consumption that increased every year while heat output decreased. "There's something else," she said, hesitating. "We've been having problems with the children too. Even before we had to close for the heating failure, kids were complaining about being cold in class, wearing winter coats indoors, some of them showing signs of hypothermia even with the system running normally. Parents have been asking questions we don't have answers for." That afternoon, I went back down to the basement with a different perspective. Near the back wall, where the worst cold seemed to be concentrated, I could see where newer concrete had been poured over much older stonework. The temperature at that wall was reading 28 argv, and my breath formed ice crystals that fell to the floor like snow. I was adjusting my flashlight beam when I saw the first child. She was standing near the boiler, maybe 8 years old, wearing a dark dress that looked like something from an old photograph. Pale skin, dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. For a moment we just stared at each other, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with temperature crawl up my spine. When I blinked, she was gone. My hands were shaking as I checked my thermometer again. 32-degree warmers. The number didn't make sense. It was colder inside this basement than outside during one of the worst blizzards in decades, despite a heating system that was burning fuel constantly. Over the next hour, I saw 3 more children, always at the edge of my vision until I turned to look directly, then standing there clear as day for just a moment before vanishing. They wore old-fashioned clothing, wool pants, button-up shoes, white shirts with high collars. And they were all watching me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not friendly either. Like they were waiting for something. The temperature kept dropping. By the time I climbed back upstairs, my portable thermometer was reading 38 degrees in the basement. That was getting into life-threatening territory, and I was wearing full winter gear. That evening, I called my girlfriend Emma back home, tried to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. "Maybe there's some kind of gas leak," she suggested. "Something that's displacing heat?" But I'd already checked for gas leaks, and besides, this wasn't about displacement. This was about something actively absorbing every BTU of heat the system produced. The third day was when things got genuinely terrifying. I arrived at the school to find the building temperature had dropped overnight to 42 degrees inside. Principal Martinez met me at the door wearing a parka and snow boots, her face pinched with cold and something that looked like fear. "The pipes burst last night," she said. "All of them. And Sandra, there are ice formations in the hallways that don't melt, even when we bring in space heaters." She led me to the main hallway, and I stopped dead. Ice covered the walls in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate. Not the random formation you'd expect from burst pipes, but geometric designs that seemed to follow some kind of logic. And in the center of each pattern, scratched into the ice with something sharp, were letters. Not random scratches. Words, spelled out in careful, childish handwriting. Cold, hungry, forgotten, lessons, winter, learn. "They appeared overnight," Principal Martinez whispered. "We don't know how." I followed her to the basement and immediately knew something had changed. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by sounds that made my skin crawl. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the scratch of chalk on slate, the creak of old wooden desks. And the children were everywhere. Not glimpses at the edge of vision anymore, but fully visible, standing in rows near the back wall like they were attending some kind of class. 16 children, ages maybe 6 to 12, all wearing the same style of old-fashioned school clothes. Their skin was winter pale, almost blue, and their breath formed clouds that never dissipated. They were all staring at me. The temperature in the basement had dropped to 45 by the. My exposed skin started burning within seconds, and my flashlight beam seemed dimmer, like the cold was draining the batteries. When I tried to speak, my words came out as ice crystals. One of the children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 7, stepped forward and opened his mouth. The sound that came out wasn't quite human, like wind through broken glass, forming words. Why won't you let us learn? That's when I understood. These weren't just the spirits of dead children haunting the basement. They were angry. They'd been buried with their school supplies for a reason, meant to continue their education in death. When the renovations scattered their remains and destroyed their memorial chamber, it had broken something fundamental about their rest. They weren't just absorbing heat randomly. They were trying to freeze the building solid, turn it into their permanent winter classroom where they could hold lessons forever. And they were getting stronger every day, feeding on the energy from the heating system. The boy stepped closer, and I could see frost forming on my clothes where his breath touched them. Behind him, the other children were moving, reaching into their pockets and pulling out objects that shouldn't exist. Slate boards, pieces of chalk, wooden rulers worn smooth by small hands. "We want to learn," the boy said, and his voice was getting clearer, stronger. "You will teach us." I backed toward the stairs, but more children appeared between me and the exit, not threatening exactly, but blocking the way with the innocent persistence of kids who don't understand why adults won't play their games. That's when I noticed my hands. The skin was turning white, then blue. Frostbite was setting in despite my insulated gloves. The supernatural cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. I pulled out my cell phone to call for help, but the screen was black, the device completely dead despite being fully charged when I'd entered the basement. The cold was draining everything. Batteries, heat, probably my life if I stayed down there much longer. The children began moving closer, and I could hear them whispering in unison. Not English, but something older, like a prayer or chant in a language that predated the town itself. The temperature plummeted even further, and ice began forming on the basement walls in real time. I ran, not walked, not hurried, full panic sprint up those stairs, taking them 3 at a time while my lungs burned from breathing air cold enough to damage tissue. Behind me, I could hear the children following, their footsteps echoing in perfect unison, like a marching drill. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me, then kept running until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition, and when I finally started the engine, I drove straight out of town without stopping. It took me 3 hours at a truck stop diner, drinking coffee and sitting next to a space heater, before I could feel my fingers again. The waitress took one look at my face and asked if I needed her to call someone. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, which, I realized, was exactly what had happened. That night, I called Principal Martinez from my motel room and told her the truth. All of it. The dead children, the supernatural cold, the fact that they were actively trying to turn the school into their permanent frozen classroom. I expected her to hang up on me, but she listened to every word. "What do we do?" she asked finally. "We give them what they want," I said. "Not victims, proper recognition. A memorial. Their burial chamber was destroyed, so they're trapped between worlds, getting more desperate every winter. We restore their memorial, give them back their sacred space, and maybe they'll find peace. It took 3 days to convince the town council, but the building was uninhabitable anyway, and they were facing a crisis that could destroy their only school. Frank Morrison backed me up with the historical records, and finally, they approved an emergency memorial restoration project. We worked through the weekend with a local contractor, carefully excavating the area where the old chamber had been. We found fragments of the original burial, pieces of slate boards, wooden toy soldiers, small leather shoes, tin lunch pails with names scratched into the metal in childish handwriting. Everything that could be preserved was cleaned and cataloged. We built a proper memorial chamber in the basement, with a climate-controlled glass case containing the recovered artifacts and a bronze plaque listing all 16 children who had died in the 1847 epidemic. The memorial service was held on a Monday morning, with the entire town in attendance. Principal Martinez read each child's name aloud, and Frank Morrison said a prayer for their peaceful rest. As he spoke the final words, I felt something shift in the building, not a physical sensation, but something deeper, like a held breath finally being released. The change was immediate and dramatic. The supernatural cold that had been building for 30 years simply stopped. The building's temperature climbed from 40 degrees Celsius to normal room temperature within an hour. The heating system, which had been burning fuel constantly with no effect, suddenly began working with perfect efficiency. More importantly, the children found peace. I never saw them again after the memorial service, but sometimes, especially during the coldest winter days, staff and students report seeing children playing happily near the memorial chamber. Not the desperate, angry spirits I'd encountered, but peaceful children who seemed content to finally have their story remembered. The school reopened the following week, and the heating system has worked perfectly ever since. Fuel consumption returned to normal levels, and the building maintains comfortable temperatures even during the worst blizzards. The memorial chamber has become part of the school's curriculum. Students learn about the 1847 epidemic and visit the memorial to pay their respects. But I still think about that basement sometimes, about those desperate children who'd been forgotten for over 150 years. They weren't evil, just angry about being erased from history, their memorial destroyed without ceremony or respect. The supernatural cold had been their way of reclaiming the space that should have remained sacred. The experience changed how I approach my work completely. Now, whenever I encounter mechanical problems that don't make logical sense, especially in older buildings, I research the history first. I've been called to several other sites where historical trauma was affecting modern systems, and the solution is always the same. Acknowledge the past, restore proper respect, and give peace to those who came before. Millbrook Falls sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of current students standing around the memorial. Those 16 children are finally at rest, their story preserved and their sacrifice remembered. And every winter when the snow falls heavy in that deep valley, I know they're playing peacefully in their eternal classroom, no longer hungry for the heat of the living. The dead just want to be remembered. Sometimes that's all it takes to turn a horror story into a story of healing. But sometimes, when they've been forgotten too long, when their sacred spaces have been violated, they'll freeze your blood solid before they'll let you forget them again. I was 19 when the screaming started. I'd been working grocery delivery for Mountain Fresh since high school, nothing fancy, just helping folks get their weekly supplies. Most routes were easy: suburban neighborhoods, retirement communities, places where people tip you for carrying bags to the door. But in January, our manager Steve got desperate. The guy who'd been running deliveries to Frost Hollow for 15 years just vanished. Didn't quit, didn't call in sick, just stopped showing up. His truck was found 3 days later at the bottom of Deer Creek Ravine, empty, doors wide open, engine still running. Steve needed someone to cover the route immediately. 40 families scattered throughout that isolated valley, all depending on weekly deliveries to survive the winter. The pay was double my normal rate, and I figured, how hard could it be? I should have asked why the pay was so high. Frost Hollow sits deep in the West Virginia mountains, accessible only by a single winding road that's barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. The valley runs north to south for maybe 10 miles, cabins and trailers dotted along both sides like teeth in a skull. During summer, it's probably beautiful. In January, with 3 feet of snow and temperatures dropping below zero, it feels like the end of the world. My first delivery day was a Thursday. Steve handed me the route book, a thick, worn notebook filled with Jim's handwritten notes. "Follow this exactly," he told me. "Don't deviate from the schedule, don't skip houses, don't be late. These people depend on precise timing." "Why?" I asked. Steve looked uncomfortable. "Just tradition up there. Mountain folk are particular about their routines." The drive took 2 hours through increasingly desolate country. By the time I reached the valley entrance, marked by a rusted sign reading Frost Hollow Pop. 1:27, the sun was barely visible through thick gray clouds. Snow was falling steadily, not the pretty kind you see on Christmas cards, but heavy, wet flakes that stuck to my windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The silence hit me first. Even with the truck engine running, I could hear nothing. No birds, no wind, no distant sounds of civilization. Just the crunch of tires on snow and my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the cab. The first house belonged to the Kowalskis, an elderly Polish couple who'd lived in the hollow for 60 years. When I knocked, Mrs. Kowalski answered immediately, like she'd been waiting by the door. She was a small woman, maybe 70, with pale blue eyes that seemed too large for her face. "You're not Jim," she said. "No, ma'am. I'm Marcus. Jim isn't able to do the route anymore." Something flickered across her expression. Relief? Fear? I couldn't tell. Come in. Too cold to stand in the doorway." Their kitchen was normal enough. Old appliances, handmade curtains, family photos covering one wall. But when I carried their groceries inside, I noticed something strange. The order was identical to what I'd delivered to suburban families, but the Kowalskis were clearly preparing for something bigger than personal consumption. Industrial-sized cans of soup lined the counters. Loaves of bread were stacked like cordwood. The refrigerator was so full of milk gallons that Mrs. Kowalski had to move things around just to fit the new ones. "You folks hosting a big family gathering?" I asked. Mr. Kowalski looked up from where he was organizing canned goods with military precision. "Something like that." The second house belonged to the Patterson family. Same massive food order, same evasive answers about why they needed so much. By the third delivery, I was starting to notice patterns. Every household ordered identical items in identical quantities. 12 cans of Campbell's tomato soup, no substitutions. 8 loaves of Wonder Bread, 6 gallons of whole milk, a pound of ground beef, 2 dozen eggs. All paid for with crisp new bills, exact change, like they'd coordinated their bank visits. But it was the timing that really bothered me. If I was even 5 minutes late to a house, the customers would be waiting outside, visibly agitated. Mrs. Henderson at the fourth stop actually grabbed my arm when I was running behind schedule. "You can't be late," she whispered, her grip surprisingly strong for an 80-year-old woman. "The timing is important, very, very important." "Why?" I asked. She glanced around nervously, as if someone might be listening. "Some traditions are older than memory, child. Older than this town, older than the families that settled here. We keep the schedule because that's how it's always been done. That's how we stay safe." Safe from what? I wanted to ask, but she'd already turned away, hurrying back inside with her groceries like she'd said too much. The houses got more isolated as I worked my way deeper into the valley. Gravel driveways wound through thick stands of pine and oak, some so long I couldn't see the buildings from the main road. The snow was falling heavier now, and the temperature was dropping fast. By the time I reached my 20th delivery, the afternoon light was already fading, even though it was barely 3 o'clock. That's when I started hearing things. At first, it was just background noise, branches creaking in the wind, snow sliding off roofs, normal winter sounds. But as I worked my way through the route, I began noticing sounds that didn't fit. Footsteps crunching through snow, but when I looked around, the yards were empty. Voices calling from the tree line, too distant to make out words, but urgent somehow, like someone giving warnings or instructions. The worst was the breathing. I first noticed it at the Williams place, an old farmhouse set back from the road by about a quarter mile. I was carrying groceries to the front porch when I heard it. Slow, deliberate breathing, like something large was watching me from the woods. The sound was wrong, too deep and too rhythmic to be human, too controlled to be an animal. I stopped walking and listened, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You hear that too?" said a voice behind me. I spun around. An old man was standing in the doorway. Mr. Williams, I assumed. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. "Hear what?" I asked, though my heart was racing. "The watching," he said simply. "It starts this time of year, gets stronger as winter deepens." He gestured for me to bring the groceries inside. Best not to linger in the open. His kitchen was like all the others, stockpiled with far more food than 2 elderly people could eat. But Williams had something the other houses didn't. Windows covered with heavy blankets, blocking any view of the outside. "Why the covered windows?" I asked. "Some things are better not seen," he replied, then added quietly, "Some things are better not seeing." You. As I worked my way through the remaining deliveries, the sounds grew more frequent and more distinct. Footsteps followed me from house to house, always staying just inside the tree line, just out of sight. The breathing became more pronounced, sometimes accompanied by low rumbling sounds, like a large dog growling, but deeper, more resonant. By the time I reached my final delivery, the Hendricks place at the very end of the valley, my hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. The house was a small cabin tucked against the base of the mountain, surrounded by towering pines that blocked most of the remaining daylight. As I parked, I realized how completely isolated this place was. No neighbors within shouting distance, no cell phone signal, just me, an elderly woman, and whatever was making those sounds in the forest. Mrs. Hendricks was waiting on her porch, a small figure in a heavy coat and wool hat. She seemed relieved to see me, but her relief was mixed with something else. Anticipation? Anxiety? I couldn't tell. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, helping me carry groceries inside. "We were worried about the timing." "We?" She paused, realizing her slip. I was worried. about the schedule. But I'd noticed how she kept glancing at her watch, checking the time against some internal countdown. It was 5:47 p.m. when I finished unloading her order. She seemed satisfied with the timing, nodding to herself as she signed the delivery receipt. "Will you stay for coffee?" she asked. "Warm up before the drive back?" I should have said no. Should have gotten in my truck and driven straight out of that valley. But the thought of facing that winding mountain road in the dark, with snow falling and something breathing in the woods, made me accept her invitation. Her kitchen was the most heavily stocked I'd seen all day. Food was piled everywhere, on counters, shelves, even stacked on the floor. Industrial quantities, like she was preparing to feed an army. While she made coffee, I wandered into her living room, which had a large picture window facing the backyard. That's when I saw the lights, small flickering flames moving through the forest behind her house. Not flashlights or lanterns, but actual fire, torches or candles being carried by unseen figures. Dozens of them, moving in a coordinated pattern, converging on something deeper in the woods. "Mrs. Hendricks," I called, "there are lights in your backyard." She appeared beside me instantly, moving with surprising speed for her age. When she saw what I was looking at, her face went pale. "Oh no," she whispered. "It's too early. We're not ready yet." "Ready for what?" Before she could answer, I heard voices outside, human voices, calling to each other in the darkness. Car engines starting up, doors slamming. The entire valley seemed to be mobilizing for something. "I have to go," Mrs. Hendricks said urgently. "You need to leave. Now. Drive straight out of the valley and don't stop for anything." "What's happening?" "The feeding," she said, then caught herself. "I mean, family gathering. Big family gathering tonight." But through the window I could see more lights now. Headlights moving along the mountain roads, converging on the same area as the torches. Every family I'd delivered to that day was heading somewhere, carrying something. And that breathing sound I'd been hearing all afternoon was getting louder, more frequent, like whatever made it was getting excited. Mrs. Hendricks practically pushed me toward the door. "Go, please." Before, a sound cut her off. A howling noise that started low and rose to an ear-splitting shriek, echoing off the mountains and seeming to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely, something that made every instinct in my body scream, "Run." "What was that?" I whispered. Mrs. Hendricks's face had gone completely white. "It's hungry," she said simply, "and we're late." I ran for my truck, but before I could reach it, I heard Mrs. Hendricks calling my name. When I turned back, she was standing in her doorway, holding a large pot of something that smelled like beef stew. "Help me carry this," she said. "Please. There isn't time to explain, but if you don't help us, people are going to die." Against every rational thought in my head, I found myself helping her load pot after pot of prepared food into her old pickup truck. She worked with frantic efficiency, like someone racing against a deadline. Other vehicles were arriving, the Kowalskis, the Pattersons, the Williams, all the families from my route. Everyone was carrying food, massive quantities of it, enough to feed hundreds of people. "Follow me," Mrs. Hendricks said, climbing into her truck. "Stay close, and whatever happens, don't get out of your vehicle." The convoy of trucks and cars wound deeper into the mountains, following logging roads I hadn't noticed during my deliveries. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature had dropped so much I could see my breath inside my heated cab. The breathing sound was getting louder, closer, more frequent. Whatever was out there, it knew we were coming. We stopped at a clearing about 2 miles from Mrs. Hendricks's house. In the headlights, I could see makeshift tables set up in the snow, long planks balanced on tree stumps, arranged in neat rows like a massive outdoor dining hall. The residents began unloading their trucks, setting out the prepared food with practiced efficiency. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, vegetables, bread, gallons of milk, a feast for dozens of people. But there were no people, just the families from the valley, maybe 30 people total, arranging food for a much larger gathering that didn't exist. "Stay in your truck," Mrs. Hendricks called to me. "No matter what you see, stay inside." The families finished their preparations and retreated to their vehicles, forming a semicircle around the food tables. Engines idling, headlights illuminating the feast, everyone waiting. I checked my watch. 7 p.m. exactly. That's when the forest came alive. The breathing sounds multiplied, coming from all directions. Trees began shaking as something large moved through them, breaking branches, pushing through the underbrush. The sounds were getting closer, and I could hear something else now. A wet, sliding noise, like something dragging itself across the ground. Then I saw them. They emerged from the tree line slowly, cautiously, like animals approaching a feeding station. But they weren't animals. They were tall, maybe 8 feet, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and they moved with a fluid, unnatural grace that made my stomach turn. There were dozens of them, maybe more, slipping out of the darkness like nightmares made flesh. Their faces were the worst part, almost human, but wrong in every detail. Eyes too large, mouths too wide, features that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. And they were hungry. I could see it in the way they approached the food, in the desperate eagerness of their movements. They fell upon the feast with animalistic intensity, tearing at the food with hands that ended in 2 long fingers, making wet eating sounds that carried clearly in the cold air. But they were organized about it, almost ceremonial. They didn't fight over portions or grab randomly. Each creature seemed to know exactly what it was supposed to take, exactly how much it needed. I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, watching something that shouldn't exist devour food I'd helped deliver. The breathing sounds were overwhelming now, coming from the creatures as they fed, a rhythmic panting that seemed synchronized, like they were all breathing as one organism. Then one of them looked at me. It was feeding at the closest table, maybe 20 feet from my truck. When it raised its head, our eyes met through the windshield. Its face was like looking at a human reflection in disturbed water, recognizable but horrifyingly distorted. And it was intelligent. I could see awareness in its eyes, calculation, curiosity about the young man sitting in the delivery truck. It stood slowly, never breaking eye contact, and began walking toward my vehicle. I fumbled for the ignition, but Mrs. Hendricks' voice cut through my panic. "Don't move, don't run. It's just curious." The creature reached my truck and pressed one long-fingered hand against the driver's side window. The glass fogged instantly from its touch, and I could smell something sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with decay. It studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, tilting its head like a bird examining an interesting insect. Then it smiled. The expression was so hideously wrong on that almost human face that I nearly vomited. It was trying to mimic human behavior, to show friendship or gratitude, but the result was a nightmare parody of human emotion. Too many teeth, all of them pointed, lips that stretched too far across its face, eyes that glittered with an alien intelligence that found my fear amusing. Finally, it stepped back and returned to the feeding tables. Within minutes, all the food was gone. The creatures began retreating into the forest as silently as they'd emerged, disappearing between the trees until only the empty tables remained in the snow. The residents began cleaning up immediately, loading the empty pots and platters back into their trucks with the same efficient teamwork they'd shown during setup. Nobody spoke. Nobody acknowledged what had just happened. It was like a practiced routine they'd performed countless times. Mrs. Hendricks approached my truck window. "Follow me back," she said quietly. "We need to talk." The drive back to her cabin passed in stunned silence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer, and my mind kept replaying that moment when the creature had smiled at me. By the time we reached her house, I was fighting off waves of nausea. Inside, she made coffee with steady hands while I sat at her kitchen table, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Finally, she sat across from me and began to explain. "They've been here longer than anyone remembers," she said. "The first settlers found them, back in the 1800s, called them the Hollow Folk. They're not exactly alive, not exactly dead. Something in between." "What are they?" "Hungry," she said simply. "Always hungry. In summer they can forage, find enough in the forest to survive. But winter," she shook her head, "winter they need more. They need us. Why don't you just leave? Move away?" Mrs. Hendricks laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think we haven't tried? The Kowalskis tried to sell their place 5 years ago. Made it as far as Charleston before their car broke down. Strange accidents kept happening. Flat tires, engine problems, road washouts. Every time they tried to leave permanently, something went wrong. The Hollow doesn't let go of its people easily. So you're trapped here." "We're needed here," she corrected. "The Hollow folk don't understand human civilization, human food systems. They just know they're hungry, and they know we can provide what they need. As long as we feed them regularly, keep them satisfied, they leave the town alone." "Miss a feeding?" She shuddered. "People disappear. Always in winter, when they're hungriest." "Like Jim?" She nodded sadly. "Jim tried to skip a delivery last month. Thought maybe if he just stopped coming, the problem would go away. They found his truck, but never found him. They never leave enough to bury." The coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're part of it now. You brought the food that keeps them satisfied. They've seen you, accepted you. If you try to quit suddenly like Jim did..." She didn't finish the sentence. I left Frost Hollow that night with the understanding that I was now trapped in the same arrangement as the residents. Every Thursday, I would deliver groceries that would become offerings to things that shouldn't exist. Miss a week, and I might end up like Jim. Over the following months, I learned more about the Hollow Folk. They were territorial, claiming the entire valley as their domain. They were intelligent, capable of complex planning and coordination. And they were patient, willing to wait for their weekly feedings as long as the schedule was maintained. But they were also growing bolder. By March, I started seeing them during daylight hours, watching from the tree line as I made my deliveries. They never approached during the day, but their presence was constant, a reminder that they were always watching, always counting down to the next feeding time. The residents told me stories passed down through generations, tales of families who tried to break the arrangement, who attempted to leave or stop the feedings. None of the stories ended well. The Hollow Folk had learned over the decades exactly how much pressure to apply to keep their food source reliable. In April, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to escape the arrangement, I embraced it completely. I moved to a cabin just outside the valley, close enough to make deliveries year-round but far enough from the feeding grounds to sleep peacefully. I bought a more reliable truck, invested in emergency supplies, learned the mountain roads like the back of my hand. The residents accepted me as one of their own. Mrs. Hendricks taught me how to prepare the offering meals, how to arrange the feeding stations, how to read the signs that indicated the hollow folks' mood and hunger levels. Mr. Kowalski showed me the boundaries of their territory, the places I could safely park during feedings, the emergency routes to use if something went wrong. I learned that there were other communities like Frost Hollow scattered throughout Appalachia, remote valleys where ancient agreements were maintained, where human settlements provided sustenance for things that predated civilization. Some fed creatures in caves, others maintained offerings for forest entities. A few dealt with things that lived in deep mountain lakes. We were all part of a network of caretakers, maintaining balances that kept older, hungrier things from venturing into the modern world in search of easier prey. By winter's end, I understood my role completely. I wasn't just a delivery driver anymore. I was a keeper of ancient contracts, a bridge between human civilization and something far older and more dangerous. The pay was good, but that wasn't why I stayed. I stayed because someone had to. Because the alternative, letting the hollow folk grow hungry enough to venture beyond their valley, was unthinkable. Now it's been 2 years since that first feeding. I still make the Thursday deliveries, still help arrange the weekly offerings. The residents trust me completely, treat me like family. The hollow folk recognize me, tolerate my presence, even seem grateful in their alien way. But I've learned something else in these 2 years, something that keeps me awake some nights. The arrangement is changing. The hollow folk are growing in number, requiring larger feedings, more frequent offerings. What satisfied them 2 years ago barely keeps them content now, and they're getting curious about the world beyond their valley. Last month I caught one of them following my truck almost to the main highway before turning back. They're testing boundaries, exploring the limits of their territory, learning. I don't know how much longer the old arrangements will hold. Don't know how much longer weekly feedings will be enough to keep them satisfied. But I do know this. As long as I can keep making those Thursday deliveries, as long as the people of Frost Hollow can maintain their ancient contract, something far worse than hunger stays contained in that valley. Some jobs are about more than money. Some jobs are about keeping nightmares from spreading beyond the places where they belong. Every Thursday, I drive up that mountain road with a truck full of groceries, knowing that I'm carrying more than food. I'm carrying the thin line between our world and theirs, maintaining a balance that's kept both sides alive for longer than anyone remembers. And on quiet winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the forest sounds different than it should, I can still hear them breathing in the darkness, waiting patiently for their next meal, still hungry, always hungry, but fed. I'm Danny Cooper, and I'm 29 years old. Right now I'm sitting in my apartment in Lexington, but back in February of last year, I was driving snowplow for a little mountain town called Harlan's Ridge, up in southeastern Kentucky. Population 290, give or take whoever's visiting family or whoever's moved away for work. I'd been doing maintenance for the city of Lexington for about 3 years, mostly road repair and some snow removal when we got hit, but nothing like what I was about to get into. The job came up because their regular plow driver, a guy named Earl Hutchins who'd been doing it for 15 years, just up and disappeared in the middle of February. Not disappeared like he quit or moved away. Disappeared like one day he didn't show up for work, and when they went to check on him, his truck was in the driveway. but he was nowhere to be found. His wife said he'd gotten up at 4 a.m. like always, had his coffee, and headed out to check the roads. Never came home. They found his plow truck parked on Route 421, keys still in it, engine running, but no Earl. The town was desperate. They'd gotten hit with back-to-back blizzards, and without someone to keep the roads clear, they were completely cut off. No supply deliveries, no emergency services, nothing. The state wasn't going to prioritize a road that served less than 300 people, especially not with the way the snow was coming down. So when my supervisor in Lexington got a call asking if anyone was available for emergency contract work, I volunteered. The pay was good, real good, and honestly, I needed the money. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been talking about getting married, and I was trying to save up for a ring. I drove up there on a Tuesday morning, following a state plow that had cleared the main highway enough to get through. Harlan's Ridge sits in a valley between two ridgelines, connected to the outside world by about 40 miles of winding mountain roads that snake up and down elevations and around curves you can't see past until you're already in them. Beautiful country, don't get me wrong, but isolated in a way that makes you understand why mountain people are the way they are. The town itself is pretty much what you'd expect. A main street with a general store, a post office, a diner, and a gas station that also serves as the unofficial town meeting place. Most of the houses are scattered up the hollows and on the ridges, connected by gravel roads and dirt tracks that have been there since before anyone can remember. The people were friendly enough, but there was something about the way they looked at me when I introduced myself as the new plow driver. Not unfriendly, exactly, but like they were sizing me up for something I didn't understand yet. Mayor Janet Russell, a woman in her 60s who ran the general store when she wasn't handling town business, showed me to Earl's truck and handed me a route map that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were wearing through. "This here shows you what roads to clear and in what order," she said, pointing at different colored lines. "Green roads get cleared first. That's emergency access. Yellow roads get cleared when you can manage it. And these red sections here." She paused, tapping her finger on several marked areas. "These you don't plow. Ever." I asked her why, and she just said that's how Earl always did it, and that's how his predecessor did it, and that's how it's always been done. When I pressed her on it, she got that look mountain people get when they've said all they're going to say about something. "Just follow the map, Danny." Earl knew what he was doing, and he never had problems following it. The truck was a massive International with a 12-foot blade and enough salt and sand capacity to handle pretty much anything the mountains could throw at it. Earl had kept it in good condition, and all the controls were clearly marked. What struck me as odd were the modifications. Extra mirrors welded onto the cab, a spotlight on the passenger side that could rotate 360 degrees, and what looked like reinforced side panels. When I asked about them, the mayor just said Earl liked to be thorough. The first few days went smoothly enough. I learned the roads, got a feel for the truck, and started to understand the rhythm of mountain snow removal. The people were appreciative, waving when I passed by their houses, bringing me coffee when I stopped to clear around the general store. But I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. First were the posts. Along certain sections of road, there were wooden posts driven into the ground, not county markers or mile markers, but rough-hewn logs about 6 feet tall with symbols carved into them. They looked old, weathered by decades of mountain weather, and the symbols didn't match anything I'd ever seen. Some looked like trees with too many branches, others like animals that weren't quite right. Legs in the wrong places, heads that were too big or too small. They were always placed in pairs, one on each side of the road, like they were marking the beginning and end of something. The red sections on the map corresponded exactly to where these posts were. And every time I approached one of these areas, something felt off. The air got thicker somehow, like the pressure was wrong. The truck's engine would start running rougher, and the radio would fill with static. But the thing that really got to me was the resistance. When I plowed the normal sections of road, the blade cut through the snow like you'd expect, smooth even, with the occasional bump from a rock or a stick. But in the areas near those posts, even though I wasn't supposed to plow them, I could feel something different when the blade got close to the snow line. It was like there was something buried in the snow that the blade was hitting, something big and solid that shouldn't have been there. The first time I felt it, I stopped the truck and got out to look. The snow was deep, probably 3 feet, and all I could see were the marks where my blade had scraped the surface. But when I kicked at the snow where I'd felt the resistance, my boot hit something hard. I tried to dig down a little, and that's when I found the first bone. It was huge, bigger than anything I'd ever seen from a deer or a bear, and yellowed with age like it had been there for years. The shape was wrong too. It looked like a leg bone, but it was too long and too thick, and there was a joint at the end that didn't match any animal anatomy I knew. I kicked some more snow away and found more bones, ribs that were as long as my arm, and what looked like part of a skull that was definitely not from anything that should be living in the Kentucky mountains. I covered them back up and got back in the truck, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was an old cow that had died up here, or deer bones that had gotten scattered by coyotes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at something that didn't belong in these mountains, or anywhere else for that matter. That night, I stayed at a little bed and breakfast that the mayor had arranged for me, run by an elderly couple named the Fitzgeralds. Over dinner, I mentioned the bones to Mrs. Fitzgerald, trying to sound casual about it. She got real quiet and looked at her husband, who just shook his head slightly. "Did Earl ever mention anything like that?" I asked. "Earl minded his own business," Mr. Fitzgerald said. "Same as his daddy before him, same as you should." But Mrs. Fitzgerald was more talkative. After her husband went to watch TV, she sat back down at the kitchen table with me. "You found them near the posts, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Earl found them too, his first year. Asked all the same questions you're probably asking. But he learned, same as his daddy learned, same as you'll learn if you're smart." She paused, looking toward the living room where her husband was. "This mountain's been here a lot longer than any of us. Some things are better left alone." The next few days, I tried to focus on just doing the job, clearing the green and yellow roads, staying away from the red sections, keeping the town connected to the outside world. But the more I worked those roads, the more I noticed things that didn't fit. There were tracks in the snow that didn't belong to any animal I knew. They were bipedal, like a person walking, but the stride was too long and the feet were too big. Each print was easily twice the size of my boot, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. They would appear along the road, cross it, and disappear into the tree line on the other side. Sometimes they followed the road for a quarter mile or more before veering off into the woods. And then there was the damage to the roads themselves. In certain sections, the asphalt was cracked in patterns that didn't make sense. Not frost heaves or settling damage, but cracks that looked like something incredibly heavy had stepped on the pavement. The spacing was consistent with those footprints I'd been seeing, and some of the cracks had a depth that suggested whatever made them weighed a lot more than any person. The truck started having problems too, but only in specific places. The hydraulics for the blade would fail right near the posted sections, or the engine would stall for no reason. I'd radio back to town, and someone would drive out with tools, but by the time they got there, everything would be working fine again. Earl had the same problems. One of the mechanics told me, "Truck just doesn't like certain parts of the road. You'll get used to it." But it wasn't just mechanical problems. Sometimes I'd be driving along, concentrating on keeping the blade at the right angle, and I'd catch movement in the mirrors. Something big moving between the trees, keeping pace with the truck. When I'd stop and look back, there'd be nothing there except those massive footprints crossing the road behind me. The smell started about a week into the job. In certain areas, especially near the posted sections, there'd be this overwhelming musky odor that would seep into the truck cab even with the windows closed and the heater running. It wasn't like any animal smell I'd ever encountered. Too strong, too thick, with an almost metallic undertone that made my eyes water. And then I started hearing the sounds. It started with what sounded like trees falling in the distance, that loud crack and crash you hear when a big tree comes down. But when I'd look toward the sound, I'd see all the trees still standing. The sounds were coming from deeper in the woods, and they had a rhythm to them that didn't match natural treefall. Too regular, too deliberate. Then came the vocalizations. I don't know what else to call them. They'd start as a low rumbling sound, almost below the range of hearing, and then build into something that was part howl, part roar, part something I can't even describe. Too deep for a human voice, but with an intelligence behind it that was definitely not animal. And loud, so loud that it would echo off the ridgelines and seem to come from every direction at once. The first time I heard it clearly, I was clearing a section of road about 5 miles out from town. It was late afternoon, overcast and snowing lightly, and I was making good time when the sound rolled down from the ridge above me. It started as that low rumble, and then climbed in pitch until it was shaking the windows of the truck cab. I stopped the plow and sat there listening, trying to figure out what could make a sound like that. That's when I saw it. About 100 yards up the slope, something was moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just shadows, but then I realized it was too big and too purposeful to be shadows. It was bipedal, walking upright like a person, but it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark fur or hair, and it moved with a confidence that told me it knew exactly where it was and what it was doing. It stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked down at me. Even from that distance, I could see that its proportions were wrong for a human. The torso was too broad, the arms too long, the head too large. And it was watching me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone, leaving me sitting in the truck wondering if I'd actually seen what I thought I'd seen. That night, I called Sarah and tried to explain what was happening without sounding like I'd lost my mind. She listened patiently, but I could tell she thought I was just stressed from the isolation and the strange new job. "Maybe you should come home," she said. "Let them find someone else to do it." But I couldn't do that. The town was depending on me, and the money was too good to walk away from. Besides, I was starting to understand that whatever was happening up here was bigger than just one person's job. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to the map and the way the roads were laid out. The red sections weren't random. They formed a pattern that encompassed several square miles of mountain territory. And the posted boundaries weren't just marking roads to avoid, they were marking the edges of something's territory. I started talking to some of the older residents, trying to get a better sense of the town's history. What I learned was that Harlan's Ridge had been dealing with this situation for decades. The territorial boundaries had been established sometime in the 1970s, after a series of incidents that people were reluctant to talk about in detail. Earl's daddy was the one who worked it out. Old Jim Morrison told me over coffee at the diner. There was trouble before that, roads getting torn up, equipment going missing, people getting followed, but his daddy figured out how to make it work. Make what work? I asked. The arrangement, he said, like that explained everything. You plow the roads we need, you stay out of the places you don't belong, and everybody gets along fine. It took me a while to piece together what he was talking about, but eventually I understood. The town had worked out a territorial agreement with whatever was living on the mountain. They would respect its boundaries, avoid its territory during certain times of the year, and in return, it would allow them to maintain the roads they needed for survival. The creature, because that's what it was, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud, was most active during the winter months when food was scarce and its territory overlapped with the areas humans needed access to. The posted boundaries were where its core territory began, and the red sections on the map were roads that passed through areas it considered essential to its survival. But the arrangement was more complex than just staying out of certain areas. The creature was intelligent enough to understand the purpose of the road system and how the town depended on it. It would selectively damage sections of road to communicate its needs, blocking access to areas where it was denning or feeding, but allowing emergency access when necessary. I started to notice the pattern in how my truck was being affected. The mechanical failures weren't random. They happened when I got too close to areas the creature was actively using. The hydraulics would fail if I tried to clear snow that was blocking access to its territory, but they'd work fine when I was maintaining the roads it was willing to share. And I was being watched constantly, not just occasionally glimpsing movement in the trees, but a continuous sense of being observed and evaluated. The creature was learning my routines, my schedule, the way I operated the truck. It was studying me the same way I was trying to understand it. The breakthrough came during a particularly heavy snowfall in early March. I was working late, trying to keep the main emergency route clear, when I came around a curve and found the road completely blocked. Not by snow, but by a massive tree that had been deliberately placed across the pavement. The tree hadn't fallen. It had been cut down somewhere else and dragged into position. No chainsaw marks, no equipment tracks, but the tree was positioned too precisely to be accidental. I got out of the truck to assess the situation, and that's when I saw it standing about 50 feet away at the edge of the tree line. It was even larger than I'd realized, probably closer to 9 feet tall, with a build that was massively muscular but still proportioned like something that could move quickly when it needed to. Its face was almost human, but not quite, with features that were too heavy and eyes that were too intelligent for any animal. We looked at each other for a long moment, and then it did something that changed everything. It pointed, not at me, but past me, down the road toward town. Then it pointed at the tree blocking the road, and then back toward its territory. The message was clear: this road is closed, go back that way. I understood then that this wasn't just a territorial animal defending its space. This was an intelligent being that understood the road system, understood how the town worked, and was communicating its needs in the only way it knew how. I got back in the truck and drove back to town without trying to move the tree. The next morning, when I returned to check on the road, the tree was gone. But there were new claw marks on several trees along that section of road. Marks that went 12 feet up the trunk, forming clear boundary indicators. From that point on, the job became less about plowing roads and more about maintaining a communication system with something that most people would refuse to believe existed. The creature would mark trees to indicate boundaries, move obstacles to block access to sensitive areas, and leave tracks in specific patterns to show me where it was safe to clear snow. I started carrying a camera, thinking I might try to get some evidence of what was happening, but the creature seemed to know when I had it with me. On days when I brought the camera, I wouldn't see any sign of it. On days when I left it at home, it would be clearly visible from the truck, sometimes even approaching close enough that I could see the details of its face and hands. The hands were what convinced me this wasn't just an unknown animal. They were too much like human hands, but larger and stronger, with longer fingers and claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And the way it used them was too purposeful, too deliberate. It would point, gesture, even manipulate objects with a dexterity that no animal possessed. As the winter progressed and spring started to approach, the creature's behavior changed. It became less territorial about the roads, allowing me to clear areas that had been off-limits earlier in the season. The mechanical problems with the truck became less frequent, and the sense of being constantly watched decreased. I realized that the territorial boundaries weren't fixed. They changed based on the creature's needs and the season. During the harshest part of winter, when it needed access to the most territory for survival, it was more aggressive about defending its space. But as conditions improved and food became more available, it was willing to compromise. The town had learned to work with these seasonal changes over the decades. They knew when to push for access to certain roads and when to back off. They understood that their survival depended on maintaining this delicate balance with something that could easily make life impossible for them if it chose to. By the time the snow stopped falling regularly and my contract was coming to an end, I'd developed something like a working relationship with the creature. Not friendship. I don't think it was capable of that kind of relationship with humans, but a mutual understanding. It knew I respected its boundaries, and I knew it would allow me to do the job the town needed done. My last day on the job, I was making a final run through all the roads to clear the last of the snow when I found something waiting for me on the truck seat. It was a piece of carved wood, about the size of my palm, with symbols cut into it that matched the ones on the posts. I don't know how it got into the truck. I'd had it locked, but there it was. I kept that carving, and I still have it today. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, trying to understand what it meant. Was it a thank you, a warning, a reminder? I'll probably never know. When I got back to Lexington, I tried to tell Sarah about what had really happened up there, but she thought I'd been alone on the mountain too long and my imagination had gotten the better of me. We broke up a few months later, not because of the mountain, but because I'd changed in ways that made it hard for us to connect anymore. I never went back to Harlan's Ridge, but I kept in touch with Mayor Russell for a while. She told me they found someone local to take over the plow route, someone whose grandfather had done the same job decades earlier and understood the arrangements. The town was doing fine, she said, and the roads were being maintained according to the traditional understanding. I still work for the city of Lexington, still do snow removal when we get hit with storms. But it's different now. Regular snow removal on regular roads with regular equipment failures and regular problems. Nothing territorial, nothing intelligent watching from the tree line, nothing that makes me question what I think I know about the world. But sometimes, when I'm driving the plow through a particularly isolated area, I'll catch movement in the mirrors, and my heart will jump. Not because I'm afraid, but because part of me misses the complexity of that mountain job, the sense that I was part of something larger and older than anything I'd ever imagined. I learned something important up there in those mountains. Humans aren't the only intelligent species on this planet, and we're not the only ones with territorial needs and survival requirements. Sometimes the best we can do is find ways to coexist, to respect each other's boundaries, and to maintain the delicate agreements that allow us all to survive. The world is stranger and more complex than most people want to believe, and sometimes that's for the best. Some knowledge is meant to be shared only among those who need it to do their jobs and keep their communities safe. I was privileged to be trusted with that knowledge, even if I didn't understand its importance until after I'd proven myself worthy of it. Looking back now, I realized that what happened on Harlan's Ridge wasn't a supernatural experience or a cryptid encounter. It was diplomacy. Ancient, wordless diplomacy between two intelligent species that had learned to share territory out of mutual necessity. And for a few months, I got to be a small part of that ongoing negotiation between the human world and something far older than any of us can imagine. I was 26 when I took the job at Pine Ridge Pharmacy, and I'm 28 now. I don't work there anymore. I don't work as a pharmacist anywhere, actually. My hands shake too much now, and I can't be around certain smells, that antiseptic medicinal smell that all pharmacies have. It sends me right back there, to that winter in the mountains when I learned what people will do to stay alive. I'd been working at a CVS in Charlotte, paying off student loans, going through the motions. Life was predictable but boring. When I saw the posting for night shift coverage at a small mountain pharmacy, the pay was almost double what I was making. Pine Ridge, North Carolina, population 420, tucked away in a valley where cell service barely reaches, and the nearest hospital is 2 hours on winding mountain roads. They needed someone to handle overnight emergencies during flu season. Looking back, I should have asked why they couldn't find anyone local to work nights. Pine Ridge sits in this bowl between mountains, connected to the outside world by one narrow road that becomes impassable when the snow gets bad. In winter, it feels like you're on an island. The pharmacy was the only 24-hour medical facility for 50 miles, which is why they needed overnight coverage. Dr. Mitchell, who'd been practicing there for 30 years, would call in emergency prescriptions throughout the night. I rented an apartment above the hardware store from Mrs. Patterson, who seemed genuinely excited to have a young person in town. "We don't get many outsiders," she said, showing me around the small space, "especially ones willing to work nights. Most folks around here are early-to-bed types." The pharmacy itself was cramped but well-stocked. Carl, the previous night pharmacist, spent a week training me before retiring. He was eager to leave, kept checking his watch, mentioning how he was ready to get back to normal sleep. I figured he was just tired of the schedule. My first month was quiet. 3 or 4 calls per night, mostly standard prescriptions. But I started noticing patterns that seemed odd. Dr. Mitchell prescribed a lot of medications I'd never seen in rural settings, specialized drugs for rare conditions, experimental treatments that should have required specialist approval. And the dosages were always identical, regardless of the patient's age or weight. The patients themselves were what really caught my attention. This was a town of 420 people, most of them families who'd lived there for generations. But everyone looked perfect. Not just healthy, perfect. No one had acne, bad teeth, or even normal signs of aging. Mrs. Henderson was listed as diabetic but looked like she could run marathons. Jimmy Parker supposedly had severe asthma but jogged up the steep hill to the pharmacy without breathing hard. Then there were the refills. People came back constantly, claiming they'd run out of medication early. Every excuse in the book: dropped pills, pet got into them, forgot to take them, and needed to catch up. But when I checked their histories, This happened with every patient, every month. They were burning through medications twice as fast as medically possible. The medications themselves were another puzzle. Most came from Meridian Biosciences, a company I couldn't find any real information about online. The packages arrived late at night via unmarked courier, and when I tried asking the delivery drivers questions, they'd just shrug and leave quickly. What bothered me most was how the patients acted when they picked up prescriptions. There was this desperation in their eyes, especially if I was running late filling an order. They'd pace, check their watches, ask repeatedly when their medications would be ready. It reminded me of addicts waiting for their fix, but these were supposedly treatments for diabetes, arthritis, blood pressure. I started keeping notes, trying to figure out the pattern. Over 6 weeks, I documented that every single person in town was on some variation of the same drug protocol. Children, elderly, everyone. The medication combinations should have caused dangerous interactions, but instead of getting sick, people seemed almost supernaturally healthy. The breakthrough came during a blizzard in February. The road into town was closed, and I was alone in the pharmacy when I heard scratching at the back door around 2 a.m. When I opened it, Mrs. Patterson was standing there in the snow, still in her nightgown, her feet bare and bleeding. "I need my medication," she said, and her voice sounded wrong, hoarse, strained. "I'm 3 hours late." I told her to come inside, that she was going to freeze, but she just kept repeating that she needed her medication. When I turned on the lights, I saw what the darkness had hidden. Her hair was falling out in clumps. Her skin was gray and had this weird, papery texture. Her fingernails were black, and there were these dark veins visible under her skin, spreading up her arms like some kind of infection. "What's wrong with you?" I asked, reaching for the phone to call Dr. Mitchell. "Time," she whispered. "It's catching up. Please, just give me the medication." I filled her prescription, a combination of drugs I still couldn't identify, and watched her swallow the pills dry. Within minutes, the change was visible. Color returned to her skin. Her hair stopped falling out. The dark veins faded. She looked normal again, but there was something in her eyes, a relief so intense it was almost religious. "Thank you," she said, and then she was gone, walking barefoot through the snow like it was a summer evening. I spent the rest of the night going through files, trying to understand what I'd witnessed. In the back storage room, I found records going back 15 years. The pattern was clear. Pine Ridge had been some kind of medical research site, and the medications weren't treatments. They were dependencies. The earliest files showed normal prescriptions until 2010, when Dr. Mitchell partnered with Meridian Biosciences for something called Project Chronos. The research involved experimental longevity treatments designed to extend human lifespan and prevent aging. But the drugs didn't cure anything. They created artificial dependencies. Stop taking them, and your body would rapidly attempt to catch up to where it should have been naturally, aging years in hours. The consent forms were buried deep in the files, signed by every adult in town. They'd agreed to participate in exchange for extended lifespans and enhanced health. But what they hadn't understood was that they were trading their natural lifespans for artificial ones that required constant pharmaceutical intervention to maintain. I found medical reports documenting the withdrawal process. Patients who missed doses for more than 6 hours began rapid aging. 12 hours meant visible deterioration. 24 hours was usually fatal as the body tried to compress years of natural aging into a single day. The residents of Pine Ridge weren't living longer. They were trapped in a cycle of pharmaceutical dependency that would kill them if it was ever interrupted. The next night, Dr. Mitchell called me around 3 a.m. "Jessica, I need you to come to my office. We need to discuss your future here." His office was in a small building behind the medical clinic. When I arrived, half the town was there. The mayor, shop owners, families I'd been serving. They all looked normal, healthy, perfect. But now I knew what lurked beneath that perfection. "You've been asking questions," Dr. Mitchell said, looking through files. "We appreciate curiosity, but you need to understand the situation completely." They explained that Pine Ridge had been chosen for the research because of its isolation. When Meridian Biosciences approached them 15 years ago, the town was dying. Young people were leaving, older residents were succumbing to typical rural health problems, and the community was maybe 5 years from being abandoned entirely. The experimental treatments had saved them in a way. They could live for centuries now, free from disease, aging slowly, if at all. But the cost was absolute dependency on medications that had to be administered precisely on schedule. Miss a dose, and the accumulated aging would hit all at once. "The question," Dr. Mitchell said, "is whether you want to join us permanently, or if you'd prefer to leave Pine Ridge and never speak of what you've learned." I asked what happened to people who chose to leave. "They leave," he said, "but they've usually been here long enough to start the treatment themselves. And once you've started, stopping isn't really an option." That's when I realized why my hands had been steadier lately, why I'd been sleeping better, why I'd recovered from that respiratory infection so quickly. The supplements Dr. Mitchell had given me for altitude adjustment weren't vitamins. I'd been on the program for over a month without knowing it. "How long do I have?" I asked. "Before withdrawal becomes fatal?" "Maybe 18 hours now. Less if you're under stress." I looked around the room at all these people, neighbors I'd come to know, families who'd welcomed me into their community. They weren't evil. They were trapped. And now they were trapping me too, because the alternative was watching me die from withdrawal. But there was something else in their eyes, something Dr. Mitchell hadn't mentioned. They were afraid. Not of me leaving, but of something else, something about the program itself. I asked what they weren't telling me. Mrs. Patterson, who looked like she was in her 60s but had been born in 1943, spoke up. "The treatments aren't stable. They're experimental, remember? Sometimes people change." "Change how?" Dr. Mitchell tried to interrupt, but she kept talking. "The medications affect everyone differently over time. Some people's bodies adapt, become stronger, faster, heal faster. But others," she paused, "others become something else." That's when they showed me the real Pine Ridge, the parts tourists and outsiders never saw. There were residents who'd been on the program too long, whose bodies had adapted in ways that weren't entirely human anymore. They lived in the old mining tunnels beneath the town, coming out only at night to collect their medications. I met Sarah Collins, who'd been beautiful once but now had to wear heavy clothing to hide skin that had become transparent, showing the movement of organs underneath. There was Marcus Webb, whose bones had grown so dense and strong that he could punch through concrete, but whose joints had fused in ways that left him barely able to move. And Emma Rodriguez, who healed from injuries almost instantly, but whose body kept growing new organs, bulging under her clothes in ways that made her look less human every month. "This is why we needed a new pharmacist," Dr. Mitchell said. "Carl couldn't handle seeing them anymore. But you have to understand, these are rare side effects. Most of us remain stable for decades." I asked what happened if I refused to continue the treatments. "You'd age rapidly and die within a day," he said. "But if you stay and help us, we'll work to minimize the side effects. We're learning more about the program all the time." The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Stay and risk becoming something inhuman, or leave and die. But there was a third option that Dr. Mitchell hadn't mentioned, one I discovered by accident when I was looking through the medical files for information about withdrawal timelines. Some people had tried to wean themselves off the medications gradually, reducing dosages over time rather than stopping suddenly. Most had died in the process, but a few had managed to return to normal, human aging patterns. The process took months and was incredibly dangerous, but it was possible. The problem was that it required access to the exact formulations of the medications to create proper tapering schedules. And those formulations were kept in Dr. Mitchell's personal safe, not in the pharmacy files. I spent 2 weeks pretending to accept my situation while planning my escape. I studied the medication schedules, learned which residents were most likely to experience withdrawal symptoms when, and figured out that Sunday nights were when the fewest people needed emergency refills. On a Sunday night in March, when another blizzard had cut the town off from the outside world, I broke into Dr. Mitchell's office and stole the formulation files. Then I went to the pharmacy and created a month's worth of tapering medications, doses that would slowly wean me off the experimental drugs without killing me in the process. I left that night, driving through snow so heavy I could barely see the road. My plan was to get far enough away that I couldn't be easily followed, then begin the withdrawal process in a hospital where doctors could monitor me. But I'd miscalculated the timing. The withdrawal started hitting while I was still driving, and by the time I reached the main highway, I was aging visibly. My hair was turning gray, my skin was wrinkling, and my vision was deteriorating rapidly. I made it to a hospital in Asheville, but they didn't know how to treat experimental drug withdrawal. For 3 days, I lay in the ICU while my body tried to compress years of natural aging into hours. The tapering medications I'd stolen helped, but the process was still almost fatal. I lost most of my hair and gained about 15 years of apparent aging in that hospital bed. The doctors said my organs showed signs of stress consistent with severe chemical dependency, but they couldn't identify the substances involved. I told them I'd been poisoned, but couldn't give them details that would put other people at risk. The withdrawal took 6 months. 6 months of careful dose reduction while my body slowly remembered how to age normally. I looked 45 by the time it was over, though I was only 27. The doctors said I'd probably lost 10 to 15 years of my natural lifespan from the experience. I moved to Oregon after that, far from the mountains and small towns. I tried going back to pharmacy work, but the smell of medications triggers panic attacks. I work in tech support now, helping people with computer problems instead of medical ones. Sometimes I wonder about Pine Ridge. I wonder if they're still there, still trapped in their cycle of pharmaceutical dependency. I wonder how many more residents have developed side effects, transforming into something inhuman in the tunnels beneath the town. I wonder if Dr. Mitchell is still administering experimental drugs to people who don't understand the real cost of immortality. I've thought about reporting what I witnessed, but who would believe it? And what would happen to the people trapped there if the program was shut down suddenly? They'd all die within hours, including children who were born into the system and never chose it for themselves. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, Meridian Biosciences is probably setting up similar research sites, looking for other isolated communities where people are desperate enough to trade their humanity for the promise of extended life. finding new ways to trap people in dependencies they can't escape without dying. I still have nightmares about Pine Ridge, not about the people who were changing into something else, but about the ones who looked normal. The families who seemed happy, healthy, perfect, knowing that underneath that perfection was a desperation so complete that they'd willingly become medical prisoners rather than face natural death. That's the real horror of what I experienced. It wasn't monsters or supernatural forces. It was people so afraid of aging and death that they'd accept any alternative, no matter how twisted. And once they'd made that choice, there was no way back, only forward, into whatever their bodies would become after decades of experimental modification. I'm 30 now, though I look 45. My hair is gray, my skin shows the wear of accelerated aging, and I'll probably die younger than I should have. But I age naturally, and I'll die as a human being. That's worth more than all the pharmaceutical immortality in the world. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the urge to drive back to Pine Ridge, not to rejoin the program, but to warn people who might be considering it, to tell them that some prices are too high to pay, even for perfect health and extended life. But I know I'll never go back, because deep down, I'm afraid that if I saw them again, saw how healthy and perfect they looked, how much younger than me they appeared, I might be tempted to stay. And that terrifies me more than anything I witnessed in those mountains. The human desire to live forever is stronger than the desire to remain human. Pine Ridge proved that. And somewhere out there, in other isolated communities, other people are probably learning the same lesson I did. Some things are worse than death. I've seen them, and I carry their memory with me every day. I'm 24 years old, and I wish I'd never taken that substitute mail carrier job in Bitter Creek, North Carolina. But when you've got student loans breathing down your neck and rent due in 3 days, you don't get to be picky about work. The regular carrier, Dale Hutchins, had suffered a heart attack in December, and they needed someone to cover his route through the worst part of winter. 30 miles into the mountains, covering 150 addresses scattered throughout a valley where GPS doesn't work and half the roads turn to ice the moment the sun goes down. I grew up in Charlotte, so driving mountain roads in February wasn't exactly my specialty, but the Postal Service was desperate, and I needed the money. The postmaster handed me the keys to a mail truck older than I was, and a route map that looked like it had been drawn by someone having a seizure. "Just follow the main road up through the valley," he said. "Folks up there depend on their mail more than most. They get real unhappy when it's late." Bitter Creek wasn't much more than 200 people living in houses scattered across the mountainside like someone had thrown them from a plane. Most of the newer homes clustered near the main road, but the route snaked deeper into the hollows, where cabins that hadn't seen paint since the Carter administration hunkered down between the trees. Some addresses required hiking the last quarter mile because the roads just gave up trying to reach them. What struck me first was how grateful everyone seemed. In the city, mail carriers might as well be invisible, but these mountain folks would come out to wave, invite me in for coffee, ask about my family like we'd known each other for years. Mrs. Henderson, who lived in a farmhouse halfway up the valley, always had fresh cookies waiting. Tom Bradley, a Vietnam vet who lived alone, would stand on his porch every morning around 10:30 just to chat about the weather. Sarah Jenkins, a woman in her 50s whose husband had died the previous year, would practically run to her mailbox the moment she heard my truck. After about a week, I started noticing the mail volume. For a remote community of mostly elderly folks on fixed incomes, these people got an unusual amount of personal correspondence. Handwritten letters, thick envelopes, the kind of mail that suggested ongoing relationships with people all over the country. Most suburban routes I'd trained on were mainly bills and catalogs, but Bitter Creek residents received stacks of personal letters every single day. The return addresses bothered me. California, New York, Texas, Florida, addresses scattered across the country. But when I looked closer, something felt wrong. Street names that didn't sound real. Zip codes that seemed off by a digit or two. One morning, while sorting mail in the truck, I decided to look up a return address from a letter going to Mrs. Henderson. The street didn't exist. The zip code belonged to a completely different state. I figured it was probably forwarding services or people writing wrong addresses. But the more I paid attention, the more inconsistencies I found. Mail postmarked from cities where the return addresses were supposedly located, but routed through facilities that made no geographical sense. Letters that should have taken days arriving overnight. And the way people read these letters, it wasn't normal. Mrs. Henderson would sit on her porch reading letter after letter, sometimes laughing out loud, sometimes crying, occasionally having full conversations with the pages like someone was responding. Tom Bradley would get letters that made him pace his yard for an hour, gesturing and talking to himself. Sarah Jenkins would clutch certain letters to her chest and rock in her chair, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. But what really got my attention was watching them write responses. Every day, I'd pick up stacks of outgoing letters from nearly every address on my route. Long, carefully written replies to the correspondence they'd received that morning. And they were addressing these responses to the same impossible return addresses. When I mentioned to Tom Bradley that some of these addresses might not exist, he just stared at me for a long moment and said, "Son, the mail finds its way to where it needs to go. Always has." That's when I started keeping a log. Letters postmarked years in the past but delivered fresh. Correspondence from people I checked obituaries to confirm were dead. Mail from family members who had supposedly moved away decades ago but were somehow still writing from addresses that didn't exist. I was looking at mail that couldn't possibly exist, being delivered through a system that shouldn't work. The local post office was just a corner of the general store, run by an elderly woman named Ruth, who'd been postmaster for 30 years. When I asked her about the unusual mail patterns, her expression went cold. "That's just how things work around here," she said. "Has been since I took over. Best not to ask too many questions about it." But I couldn't let it go. Mrs. Henderson showed me one of her letters, from her sister Margaret, written in familiar handwriting, discussing family events and asking about her health. The problem was that Margaret had died in 1987, something Mrs. Henderson acknowledged openly. "Oh, I know she passed," she told me, "but we still keep in touch. The mail service here is special that way." That's when I understood I'd stumbled into something impossible. Every longtime resident of Bitter Creek was corresponding with dead people, not just pretending or writing therapeutic letters, actually receiving responses. Letters that arrived through the postal service, routed properly, with correct postmarks. Letters from people who couldn't write them. Tom Bradley showed me correspondence from his son who'd been killed in Iraq. "We write every week," he said, his eyes too bright, too intense. Even after he died, the letters kept coming. Ruth figured out how to keep the connection going. He gripped my arm hard enough to bruise. "You can't stop delivering them. You understand? They depend on this." I started dreading the route. The grateful smiles felt forced now, desperate. The way people watched me sort their mail, the hunger in their eyes when they saw letters from impossible sources. Sarah Jenkins cornered me one morning, begging me to make sure her husband's letters got delivered on time. He gets worried when they're late, she said. He starts calling, and the phone isn't supposed to ring anymore. That night I tried researching the history of Bitter Creek's post office. What I found made my blood freeze. Ruth had taken over in 1973, right after the previous postmaster, Dale's predecessor, had suffered what the newspaper called a complete mental breakdown. The article mentioned his claims that the mail system was connecting the living with the dead, and his attempts to shut down mail service entirely before his hospitalization. The pattern went back decades. Every postmaster in Bitter Creek either went insane or disappeared after trying to stop the supernatural mail service. Ruth was the first to embrace it, to figure out how to make it work consistently. She'd turned the post office into some kind of conduit, allowing the dead to send letters through the postal system to their living relatives. But there was a cost. I found records of missing persons in the area, all connected to the mail route. Carriers who tried to refuse deliveries or questioned the system too aggressively. People who threatened to expose what was happening. They'd simply vanish, leaving behind families who suddenly started receiving letters from them postmarked from impossible locations. I realized the residents weren't just dependent on these letters. They were trapped by them. The correspondence wasn't comfort. It was compulsion. The dead weren't offering love. They were demanding attention, maintenance, continuation of relationships that should have ended. And the living couldn't stop, couldn't break the cycle, because the moment they tried, they'd disappear and join the ranks of the letter writers. Ruth finally explained it to me when I confronted her. "The mail must flow," she said, her voice hollow. "Once the connection is made, it can't be broken. The dead don't like being ignored, and they have ways of making sure they're not forgotten." She showed me letters addressed to her from previous postmasters, all of them writing from addresses that didn't exist, all of them begging her to keep the service running. I tried to quit, but my truck wouldn't start. Tried to call the postal service, but my phone had no signal. Tried to walk out of the valley, but the roads kept leading me back to the same mailboxes, the same desperate faces waiting for their letters from the dead. I was trapped in a circuit I couldn't break, delivering mail between the living and the dead, while both sides grew more demanding with each passing day. The letters started arriving for me in the third week. Personal mail, delivered to the post office with my name on it. Return addresses I didn't recognize, but the handwriting looked familiar. Letters from my grandmother who died when I was 12, written in her careful script, asking why I hadn't visited her grave, why I'd forgotten her birthday, why I wasn't writing back. The paper smelled like her perfume. Ruth sorted my mail with the same cold efficiency she used for everyone else. "You're part of the route now," she said, "part of the system. The dead remember everyone who handles their letters, and they expect correspondence in return." She handed me a pen and stationery. "Best start writing back. They get angry when they're ignored." The temperature in the post office dropped 20 degrees every time someone tried to break the cycle. Windows would frost over, metal would become too cold to touch, and the sound of breathing would fill the air even when the building was empty. The dead were always watching, always waiting for their mail, and they had no patience for living people who tried to disrupt their correspondence. I've been delivering mail in Bitter Creek for 6 months now. My truck won't start unless I'm heading toward addresses on the route. My phone only works to call people who live in the valley. Every morning I sort letters from the dead and deliver them to the living, then collect responses that somehow reach recipients who shouldn't be able to read them. Mrs. Henderson writes to her sister about how much she misses family gatherings. Tom Bradley discusses politics and sports with his dead son. Sarah Jenkins has dinner conversations through mail with her husband, setting the table for two and reading his letters aloud to an empty chair. And every day, I enable this impossible, terrible communion between worlds that should remain separate. The worst part is that I'm starting to understand why they can't stop. The letters are addictive, providing connection and comfort that living relationships can't match. The dead remember you perfectly, love you unconditionally, never disappoint or abandon you. They offer everything the living can't provide, and all they ask in return is regular correspondence and the continuation of the postal service that makes their impossible communication possible. Ruth is training me to take over when she's gone. The route chooses its postmaster, she tells me, and you've already been chosen. She shows me how to process supernatural mail, how to maintain the connections between the living and the dead, how to ensure the system continues functioning regardless of who tries to stop it. I write letters now too. To my grandmother, to my grandfather, to relatives I never met but who somehow know my name and address. They write back with memories I never had, stories about family history, advice about life choices I haven't made yet. The dead know things the living never could, and their knowledge comes with a price I'm still learning to pay. Last week, my replacement arrived, a young woman named Jennifer, fresh out of college with student loans and no other options. I watched Ruth hand her the keys to the mail truck, the same speech about grateful mountain folks depending on reliable service. Jennifer smiled and nodded, eager to start work, completely unaware that she'd just volunteered to become a conduit between the living and the dead. I wanted to warn her, to explain what she was walking into. But my voice wouldn't work when I tried to speak the words. The system protects itself, prevents interference, ensures its own continuation. All I could do was watch another person get trapped in the endless circuit of impossible mail delivery. The dead are patient, but they're not kind. They remember every slight, every forgotten birthday, every unanswered letter. And they have all the time in the world to demand satisfaction from the living who displease them. The mail route in Bitter Creek isn't just a job. It's a prison sentence, a pact with forces that should be left undisturbed. I still deliver mail every day, sorting letters from the dead and watching the living become more dependent on impossible correspondence. Sometimes I think about what would happen if I just drove away, left the route unfinished, broke the cycle that's trapped this community in communion with their dead. But then I remember the previous carriers who tried to leave, the postmasters who attempted to shut down the service. They're still writing letters too, from addresses that don't exist, begging for the mail service to continue. Because once you're part of the system, once the dead know your name and address, you never really leave. You just change which side of the correspondence you're writing from. And every morning, when I start my route, I can feel them watching me from windows that should be empty, from graves that should be quiet, making sure I deliver their letters on time. Because in Bitter Creek, the mail must flow. The dead must be remembered, and the living must write back, no matter what the cost. I was 27 when I took the job managing Mountain View Diner in Pine Valley, Virginia. Been in restaurant management for 6 years, bouncing between corporate chains mostly. But this was different. A family-owned place in a town of maybe 450 people, nestled so deep in the mountains that GPS loses signal on the winding road up. Mrs. Chen hired me for the winter season when tourist traffic from the ski resorts keeps them busy. Good pay, quiet setting, and honestly, I needed to get away from everything after my last relationship imploded. The diner felt like stepping back in time. Red vinyl booths, checkerboard floors, that old-school counter where locals nursed coffee and watched everyone who came and went. Mrs. Chen's family had run it since the 80s, and they'd built a reputation throughout the region for exceptional food, especially their winter specialties. game meat dishes that were only available November through March. The first few weeks went smooth. Danny, the head cook, had been there 15 years and knew every recipe by heart. The winter crowd was typical mountain tourists, skiers wanting hearty breakfasts, families looking for comfort food, couples on romantic getaways. Standard stuff. But I noticed pretty quick that locals had a different relationship with the place. They'd drive through snowstorms just for specific meat dishes, calling ahead to make sure their favorites were available. What struck me was how particular everyone was about the winter meat. Danny treated it like he was handling precious artifacts. Specific storage temperatures, exact cooking times, preparation techniques that seemed unnecessarily complex for what looked like basic venison and elk. When I asked about it, he said the locals were real picky about how their meat was prepared, and the restaurant's reputation depended on getting it exactly right. The customers who ate the winter specials were different somehow. More alert, more energetic than you'd expect from small-town mountain folk. I watched this 70-year-old guy, Bill Henderson, help push a stuck car out of snow like it weighed nothing. These people moved with unusual grace, seemed to hear conversations from across the restaurant, noticed things happening outside before you could see them through the windows. About a month in, I started working later shifts and noticed the deliveries. Around midnight, pickup trucks would pull up to the back door. Not refrigerated delivery trucks, just local hunters bringing packages wrapped in old tarps and butcher paper. Danny would meet them personally, inspect everything, help carry the bundles into our walk-in freezer. When I asked Mrs. Chen about it, she said they sourced specialty meat from local hunters who'd been supplying the restaurant for years. All legal, just informal arrangements. The meat itself was unlike anything I'd handled. The texture was different, denser but somehow more tender when cooked right. The smell was richer, almost intoxicating when Danny prepared it. Customers would finish these dishes and immediately ask when we'd have them available again. Some tried to buy raw cuts to take home, but Danny always refused. House policy, he said. That's when I started noticing the dependency. Regular customers would get agitated if we were low on the winter specials. Mrs. Patterson came in one Tuesday evening when we'd run out of her usual order, and I watched her hands shake as she asked when the next delivery was coming. She looked pale, almost sick. When I suggested she try our regular menu, she just left without ordering anything. I saw it happen with others too. The Hendersons, the Morrison family, old Tom Crawford. If they went more than a few days without their usual orders, they'd start looking rough, tired, irritable, like they were fighting off the flu. But the moment they got their fix of the winter meat, they'd perk up immediately. It reminded me of addicts I'd known, that desperate need followed by instant relief. The meat's effects weren't just physical enhancement, they were chemical dependency. These people weren't choosing to eat here. They had to. Whatever was in that meat, their bodies craved it now. Without it, they got sick. With it, they maintained those enhanced abilities, but at a cost that was becoming clearer every day. I started paying closer attention to the hunting operation. The suppliers weren't just local hunters. They were organized, coordinated, using specialized equipment I didn't recognize. Heavy-duty gear, night vision scopes, tranquilizer guns alongside traditional hunting rifles. They talked in low voices about territory management and harvesting quotas and keeping the population stable. One night in February, I stayed late to help with inventory and overheard Tom Crawford talking to Danny about a difficult extraction. Something had fought back, injured two of his team before they'd brought it down. Tom showed Danny claw marks on his arm that looked too large and too deep for any animal I knew. When he noticed me listening, both men went quiet. The next delivery was different. The packages were larger, wrapped more carefully, and when Danny opened the freezer to store them, I caught a glimpse of what was inside. The meat was dark red, almost purple, with a marbled texture unlike any game I'd ever seen. But what made my stomach turn were the bones. Too long, too thick, with joint structures that didn't match any animal anatomy I recognized. That weekend, I decided to try one of the winter specials myself. Danny prepared it perfectly, a thick cut of the mystery meat, seasoned with herbs I couldn't identify, cooked to a temperature that left the center barely warm. The smell was incredible, almost hypnotic. The first bite was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted, rich and complex, with flavors that seemed to change as I chewed. The effects started within an hour. My vision sharpened, colors became more vivid. I could hear conversations from the kitchen through the closed serving window. My muscles felt stronger, my reflexes quicker. It was like every sense had been turned up to maximum clarity. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alive, like I'd been operating at half capacity my entire existence. But that night, lying in my rented cabin, I couldn't sleep. Not because I wasn't tired, because I felt too awake, too alert, like my nervous system was running on pure electricity. And I was hungry again, desperately, painfully hungry, but only for one thing. The memory of that meat consumed my thoughts, the taste lingering in my mouth like a phantom sensation. By morning, the enhanced effects had faded, but the craving remained. I understood now why the locals looked sick when they couldn't get their usual orders. This wasn't just food, it was a drug, and I'd just taken my first hit. I tried to focus on regular work, but the hunger gnawed at me constantly. Every smell from the kitchen when Danny prepared the winter specials made my mouth water and my hands shake. I found myself checking the freezer inventory, calculating how much meat we had left, when the next delivery was scheduled. The rational part of my mind knew something was wrong, but the craving overrode logic. 3 days later, I broke down and ordered another winter special. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Not just the enhanced abilities returning, but the desperate hunger finally satisfied. I told myself it would be the last time, that I'd figure out what was happening and find a way to stop. But even as I made that promise, I was already thinking about when I could eat it again. That's when I started investigating seriously. Late at night, I'd search online for information about the hunting operation, the enhanced effects, anything that might explain what was happening to me and the other customers. Most searches turned up nothing, but eventually I found fragments, forum posts about enhanced communities in isolated areas, government documents with heavy redactions mentioning biological enhancement trials, academic papers about cryptid nutrition studies that had been mysteriously withdrawn. The pieces started forming a picture I didn't want to believe. The hunters weren't tracking normal wildlife. They were harvesting something else, something that had developed unique biochemical properties. The meat provided genuine enhancement, but at the cost of permanent dependency. Once you started eating it regularly, your body adapted to require it, like an addiction you could never break. I confronted Mrs. Chen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed and locked the front door, flipping the sign to "closed." We sat in the back booth while she explained the truth. The creatures lived in the deepest parts of the mountains, in territories that had been undisturbed for generations. They were intelligent, bipedal, with human-like characteristics but larger, stronger, with biology that had evolved differently from normal primates. The local hunting families had been harvesting them for decades, managing the population to ensure sustainability while supplying meat to those who knew its true nature. The enhancement effects were real, but so was the dependency. Once your body adapted to the enhanced metabolism, stopping consumption would eventually be fatal. The withdrawal symptoms started mild but progressed to organ failure within months. The enhanced community existed because they had no choice. They needed the meat to survive. Mrs. Chen had been hoping I wouldn't try the winter specials. Most temporary employees worked their contracts and left without ever discovering the restaurant's true purpose. But now that I'd consumed the meat, I was part of the system whether I wanted to be or not. The dependency was already establishing itself in my biochemistry. The hunting operation required constant management to remain sustainable. The creatures were intelligent enough to avoid human contact, territorial enough to defend themselves when cornered, and rare enough that overharvesting could collapse the entire population. The hunters worked in coordinated teams, using knowledge passed down through generations to track and harvest the creatures without depleting their numbers below viable breeding levels. But lately, the balance had been shifting. Word was spreading about the enhancement effects, drawing new customers from outside the region. Demand was increasing faster than the hunting operation could sustainably supply. The creatures were becoming more aggressive, fighting back against hunting parties, protecting their territories more actively. Mrs. Chen showed me photos from recent hunting expeditions, scenes that looked like battlefields, trees shredded by massive claws, equipment destroyed, vehicles overturned. 3 hunters had been killed in the past month. The creatures were adapting to human hunting tactics, becoming more dangerous and more elusive. Worse, some of the enhanced customers were showing signs of advanced dependency. Personality changes, aggressive behavior, physical mutations that suggested their biochemistry was continuing to change. The meat wasn't just addictive, it was transformative, slowly altering human physiology in ways that weren't fully understood. I realized I was trapped. The craving was already too strong to ignore, and Mrs. Chen confirmed that attempting to quit cold turkey would likely be fatal within 6 months. My only choice was to become a permanent part of the enhanced community, managing my dependency while helping maintain the system that sustained it. But the system was failing. The hunting operation couldn't keep up with demand, the creatures were becoming more dangerous, and the enhanced customers were showing signs of progressive mutation. The sustainable balance that had existed for decades was collapsing under the pressure of expansion. The final delivery I witnessed told the story. Tom Crawford's team brought in only half their usual quantity, and Tom himself looked like he'd been mauled. Deep claw marks across his face, his left arm in a makeshift sling, his hunting gear torn and bloodied. He told Danny that 3 of his team were in the hospital, and they'd lost contact with the Hendricks family entirely. Their hunting cabin found empty, with signs of a struggle. The creatures weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were hunting back. That night, as I lay in my cabin fighting the hunger that would never leave, I heard sounds in the forest, heavy footsteps moving between the trees, too coordinated to be normal wildlife, too large to be human. Something was watching the town, learning our patterns, planning their response to decades of predation. Looking back now, I understand what I became part of. Not just an enhanced community, but the final phase of a predator-prey relationship that had evolved beyond sustainable limits. The creatures we'd been hunting had developed intelligence specifically to survive human predation, and now they were ready to reverse the dynamic. The Mountain View Diner still operates, but the winter specials are increasingly rare. Most of the hunting families have disappeared or stopped operating. The enhanced customers who remain are changing, their mutations becoming more pronounced, their behavior more erratic as their dependency deepens without adequate supply. I'm still here, still managing the restaurant, still fighting the hunger that defines my existence now. But I know what's coming. The sounds in the forest get closer each night. The creatures have learned to organize, to plan, to hunt cooperatively. They've been studying us while we've been consuming them, and they've developed strategies for dealing with their human predators. The enhancement was never a gift. It was bait, a way to create dependency, to tie humans to a specific location, to make us predictable and vulnerable. We thought we were the predators, but we were just being domesticated for easier harvesting. The real horror isn't what we became by eating them. It's what they're becoming by being eaten by us. And now it's hunting season, with us as the prey. To this day, I can hear them moving in the darkness, getting closer, preparing for the final reversal of our predator-prey relationship. The enhanced community created our own extinction, one delicious bite at a time. I'm Amanda Foster, and I was 19 when I took what I thought would be a simple temporary job driving a school bus in Cedar Mountain, North Carolina. This was back in February of 2018, and I'd just finished my first semester at community college when my mom called me about an opportunity. The regular driver for Route 7 had a family emergency. Her husband was in the hospital after a logging accident, and they needed someone with a clean driving record who could handle mountain roads. I'd grown up driving my dad's pickup truck through worse terrain than most people see in their lifetime, so I figured how hard could it be? The pay was decent for a temporary gig, and honestly, I needed the money. My financial aid hadn't come through yet for spring semester, and I was living in this tiny apartment above my aunt's garage in Asheville. The job was only supposed to last a few weeks, maybe a month at most, until the regular driver could come back. Route 7 covered some of the most remote areas in the county, 45 kids scattered across farms and cabins that were sometimes miles from their nearest neighbor. These weren't suburban kids waiting at neat little bus stops. These were mountain children whose families had been living in those hollers for generations, and getting to school meant navigating winding dirt roads that turned into muddy nightmares when it rained. The district supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, spent a whole afternoon going over the route with me. She was this no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been working for the school system since before I was born. The route map she gave me was incredibly detailed, more detailed than I'd expected for what seemed like a straightforward mountain bus route. There were specific roads marked with no stops in red ink, areas circled with notes like "Avoid after dark" and "Emergency only." When I asked her about it, she just said the roads could be dangerous in bad weather and left it at that. What struck me most during those first few days was how different these kids were from what I'd expected. I'd figured mountain children would be shy, maybe a little rough around the edges, but these kids were something else entirely. They were alert in a way that seemed almost unnatural for children their age. The youngest was maybe 6, the oldest around 16, and every single one of them seemed to carry themselves with this quiet awareness that reminded me more of adults than kids. My route started at 6:30 a.m., which meant I was driving through pitch-black mountain roads with nothing but my headlights and the occasional porch light to guide me. The bus was this big yellow beast from the early 2000s that handled the terrain well enough, but it groaned and wheezed climbing some of those steeper grades. Mrs. Patterson had emphasized that I needed to stick to the exact pickup times, not a minute early, not a minute late. She said the families up there ran their lives by very specific schedules, and disrupting that could cause problems. The first thing I noticed was how quickly the kids boarded. There was no dawdling, no last-minute goodbyes, no forgotten backpacks. These children appeared at their pickup spots exactly on time, climbed aboard without a word, and immediately took their assigned seats. The older kids always sat toward the back, the younger ones up front, and once they were seated, every single window shade on the bus got pulled down. When I asked Tommy Whitaker, this serious-looking 12-year-old who seemed to be the unofficial leader, why they did that, he just said it was safer that way. What really got my attention was how they watched the forest. Even with the shades down, these kids were constantly peeking out, scanning the tree line like they were looking for something specific. They'd point things out to each other in whispers. Movement in the woods, sounds I couldn't hear over the bus engine, arrangements of rocks or broken branches that apparently meant something to them. It wasn't casual observation. These children were monitoring their environment with the intensity of soldiers on patrol. The emergency procedures Mrs. Patterson had given me were unlike anything I'd ever seen for a school bus route. There were specific protocols for what she called forest encounters, detailed instructions about maintaining speed, avoiding sudden stops, and keeping the children calm during territorial crossings. The manual even included diagrams showing how to position the bus if we encountered what it vaguely referred to as wildlife obstacles. I'd assumed they meant bears or maybe wild boar, but the procedures seemed excessive for normal mountain animals. It was during my second week that I started noticing the territorial markers Tommy and the other kids kept talking about. Trees with bark stripped off in perfect vertical lines, about 8 feet off the ground. Rock cairns that appeared overnight in clearings we'd passed the day before. Broken branches arranged in geometric patterns that definitely weren't random storm damage. When I mentioned these to Mrs. Patterson, she just nodded and told me the children would explain what I needed to know when they felt I was ready. The kids had names for different areas of the forest. There was the quiet zone, where even the bus engine seemed to run softer. The watching place, where they made me slow down to almost a crawl. And the crossing, where every child on the bus would go completely silent until we'd passed through. They knew which areas were safe for emergency stops and which ones required us to keep moving no matter what. This knowledge wasn't written down anywhere. It was passed between the children like some kind of oral tradition. Around my third week, I started seeing them, the figures moving between the trees during those dark morning hours. At first, I convinced myself they were just shadows, maybe deer or other animals caught in the headlights, but shadows don't move with purpose, and they don't stop to watch a school bus pass by. These things, and I still don't know what else to call them, were tall, impossibly thin, and moved through the forest in ways that didn't follow normal patterns of walking. The children knew about them. Not just that they existed, but individual creatures with specific behaviors and territories. Sarah Beth, one of the quieter 8-year-olds, once pointed to a figure standing about 30 yards back in the trees and whispered to her seatmate, "That's the tall one from Miller's Creek. He's just checking on us." Like she was talking about a neighbor walking their dog. The other kids would nod knowingly and adjust their position in their seats based on which creature was observing us. What I came to understand was that the school bus served as a kind of mobile safe zone. These entities, and there were multiple types, not just one kind of creature, seemed to respect the bus itself. They'd watch us pass, sometimes follow parallel to our route through the trees, but they never approached the vehicle directly. The children told me that individual kids walking alone were a different matter entirely. That's why the precise timing mattered so much. That's why no child was ever late to the pickup point. and why parents coordinated so carefully around the bus schedule. The creatures showed an unsettling level of intelligence. They learned our route, positioned themselves at observation points during pickup times, and seemed to communicate with each other about our movements. Tommy explained that they'd been part of these mountains longer than any human settlement, that his great-grandfather's generation had figured out the territorial boundaries and learned to work around them rather than trying to drive them out. I remember the morning everything clicked for me. We were approaching the Whitaker farm pickup when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, something large shifting between the trees on the passenger side of the bus. I glanced over and saw one of the tall figures, maybe 10 feet from the road, just standing there watching us. But this time, instead of the usual quick glimpse, I got a good long look at it. It was human-shaped but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, maybe 8 feet, arms that hung down past where knees should be, a head that tilted at angles human necks weren't designed for. And it was studying us with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. "That's just old Long Arms," Tommy said quietly from behind me. "He's been watching the school route since my dad was little. He's not dangerous unless you're alone." The casual way he said it, like he was talking about the weather, finally made me understand what I'd gotten myself into. This wasn't just a temporary job driving kids to school. This was a carefully maintained system that allowed human children to travel safely through territory inhabited by things that definitely weren't human. The families up there had developed this entire protection network over generations. Parents took turns monitoring creature activity and would call the school if territorial patterns changed. The bus route itself was planned around known safe corridors that the entities seemed to respect. Even the timing was crucial. Early morning darkness was when these things were most active, but also when they seemed most predictable in their behavior. As the weeks went on, the children began trusting me with more detailed information. They taught me how to recognize different types of territorial markers, how to identify safe areas for emergency stops, and most importantly, how to read the creature's body language to determine if we were in actual danger versus just being observed. The kids had developed an entire survival curriculum that got passed down from older to younger students, knowledge their parents had been teaching them since they were old enough to walk. What amazed me was how matter-of-factly the whole community dealt with this situation. These weren't superstitious mountain folk telling ghost stories. These were practical families who'd figured out how to coexist with something ancient and territorial that had been in those mountains long before the first European settlers arrived. They'd adapted their daily routines, their children's education, even their economic activities around the reality of sharing territory with entities that couldn't be explained or controlled. The bus itself had been modified over the years for additional protection. The windows were reinforced with a wire mesh that was painted to match the glass. The emergency radio had been upgraded to reach not just the school district but also a network of families who monitored creature activity. There were even emergency supplies stored in hidden compartments, extra blankets, first aid supplies, and what Tommy quietly told me were calming sachets, made from local plants that seemed to discourage the entities from approaching too closely. By my 6th week, I'd become part of the community's child protection system. Parents would wave from their porches when we passed, not just in greeting, but in acknowledgement that their kids had made it safely to school another day. I started recognizing individual creatures by their preferred observation posts and learned to adjust our route timing based on their activity patterns. The children treated me as a trusted adult who understood their reality, and I realized that meant more to them than any outsider could appreciate. The regular bus driver, Mrs. Henderson, eventually recovered enough for her husband to be moved to long-term care. But by then, the district and the community had asked me to stay on permanently. These families needed someone who understood what their children faced every day, just getting to school. Someone who could navigate the complex territorial boundaries their community had learned to respect over generations. I've been driving Route 7 for 7 years now, and I've never lost a single child. I know which mornings to add extra time to the route when creature activity is high. I know which areas require special caution and which ones are safe for the kids to relax and just be children for a few minutes. Most importantly, I've learned that some things don't need to be understood or explained to be dealt with practically and safely. People sometimes ask me if I've ever considered moving back to town, getting a normal job. But the truth is, I can't imagine doing anything more important than making sure these kids get to school safely every day. Their education matters just as much as any suburban child's, and if it takes navigating territory inhabited by ancient entities to make that happen, then that's what I'll keep doing. These mountains taught me that coexistence is possible, even with things that challenge everything we think we know about the world, as long as you approach them with respect, caution, and the kind of community cooperation that's kept these families safe for generations. To this day, I still see them watching from the tree line during my morning route. Old Longarms still shows up near the Whitaker farm, and the kids still wave at him like he's part of their extended community. And in a way, I guess he is. We're all just trying to make our way in these mountains, sharing space and respecting boundaries that were established long before any of us were born.